All right, folks, it is time to get into the serious stuff here. Here in the exposure control section, we're going to be talking a lot about the primary controls for your exposure. There's going to be buttons and dials on the outside of the camera, components on the inside, features that we're going to be talking about. There is lots to get to. Now, before we get any deeper into this, I just want to remind you that you should have your camera in the photo mode, not the video mode. We'll be getting into video in section 9, but for everything else in this class, you're going to probably want to have the camera in the photo mode. On the top of the camera is the mode dial. This is our primary way of controlling the exposures and how we are going to set the exposures on the camera. So let's take a close look at this. And we're going to go through all of the settings, starting with the most simplistic options, working more manual. The full auto mode is where the camera is going to take care of everything for you. When it comes to autofocus, if you have a lens that has an A and M switch on it, you want to make sure that it is in the A position for automatic focusing. If you want a manual focus, that's fine, but that's what the M is for. If your lens does not have that switch on it, you don't need to worry about it because the camera is electronically taking care of that. There is a feature in the camera we'll talk about in the focus section that you can turn that feature on and off for those particular types of lenses. So in the full auto mode, the camera is taking care of shutter speeds, apertures, and ISO, the three main components of the exposure. And it is using all of these to try to get you a good quality exposure, not too bright, not too dark, but also making sure that you have a fast enough shutter speed so that you can handhold the camera. It's not particularly appropriate for sports photography. It might be something very different than you would choose for landscape photography. But that's what an auto mode is. It's just general stuff. It's not something particular. Now, this is probably a good mode to put the camera in if you're going to give the camera to a friend or a stranger to take photos of you and you didn't want them to mess up the camera. Number one, it gives you a basic exposure, but good one. It also limits the features and menu access. And so when you dive into the menu, there's not as many things that you can change in there. Now, we do also have an option of pressing the I button for changing some simple features in the camera. Let me show you a little bit more about this. So let's get our camera set up. We've got our camera in the full auto mode with the mode dial, and the camera is just going to give us some generally pretty good shutter speeds, apertures, and do the focusing for us. And so right now, it looks like it has chosen an auto ISO of 1000, shutter speed of 2/50th, and an aperture of f4. If I change the lens around a little bit, it does adjust for that situation a little bit. If I dive into the menu system, you're going to see some grayed out items in here, and you'll notice more if you dive further around into the menu system, and that's because we're in the auto mode, and there are little child safety locks on some of the features so that you don't accidentally change them. Now, the I button on the back of the camera is something we'll be talking more about in this class, and it is a shortcut to the I menu. And this gives you a list of some features. Some of them are going to be grayed out because we're in the auto mode that you can come in here and change. For instance, we've talked about changing image quality. You can come in here and change image quality if you want. I'm going to go ahead and leave it the same because it's fine for now. But there are other features that you can quickly access if you don't want to have to dive into the more complicated menu system. And so, really, I think if you're taking this class, you probably don't need the auto mode. But if you're going to be handing the camera over to someone else, it's a nice, simple mode to put the camera in. And it kind of just takes care of most everything that you would need to worry about if you wanted somebody just to take basic standard photos. Next up, the program mode. The program mode is actually kind of like the auto mode. The difference is that you now have full access to all the features in the camera. No more child safety locks on various different features. The program mode also doesn't go into any other features of the camera, like focusing, for instance. In the auto mode, it set the camera up for simple, basic autofocus system. In the program mode, you can change whatever you want on the focusing system. So program mode, it's basically setting shutter speeds and apertures. It's not doing anything with the ISO. You can control the ISO yourself. So it's just shutter speeds and apertures that are being set automatically here. Now, when you look in the viewfinder down along the bottom of the viewfinder or in the monitor in the back, you'll be able to see exactly what shutter speeds and what apertures were chosen. Now, once again, the actual program that is written into this tells the camera to give a quality exposure, not too bright, not too dark, but also not to have too slow a shutter speed because you're probably hand holding the camera. That's the assumption that the camera makes. It's not always accurate, but that's the assumption that it makes. And if you don't like the shutter speed and aperture combination that the camera has given you, you can adjust it. By turning the main control dial on the camera, you can activate something called flexible program, which is still a proper exposure, but a different combination of shutter speeds and apertures. And so you can adjust this if you don't like this. Now, there is a bit of a quirk to this, so let's go ahead and take a look at how this works. We're going to go ahead and move our camera into the program mode. And on the back of the camera, I have currently set an ISO of 100. And we haven't talked about ISO yet. I'm going to quickly change it up to 800 just because I'm familiar with our studio lighting here. And this is just going to make life a little bit easier for us. So right now, the camera is choosing 1/100th of a second at f5.6. If I zoom out, it goes down to f5. If I zoom in, it goes to 250 at f4. So it varies a little bit depending on the situation. So we're at 125 at f5.6, which would be perfectly fine for taking a standard exposure handheld photo. Now let's say I just wanted more depth of field. Well, I can change this back dial and you can see that the numbers are changing, not just one, but both the shutter speed and aperture. So if I want more depth of field, say I want to get it up to f11, well, I can do so here at 1/30th of a second at f11. That might not be safe for hand holding, but we are on a tripod, so I can take a photo, and that is a quality exposure. If I play this back with the previous image, we don't see really any difference in the exposure, but the actual numbers are different, and we'll show you more information here about that here in just a little bit. So that is the flexible program mode. Now, Nikon's got this weird little quirk that they've always had in their cameras, and it's that you can be changing and clicking to infinity. And let me show you what I mean. All right, let's say I wanted a faster shutter speed. And I go faster, faster, faster. Now this lens is an f4 lens, and so we're only going to be able to go to f4, but let's say I continue to click over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, well, we can't go past f4 because the lens doesn't go past f4. But if I come back a click, it doesn't change. Nothing changes, nothing changes, nothing changes, nothing changes. Oh, finally we're getting some changes, and it's because I clicked a bunch off to the side. And so you can kind of get lost in no man's land where it's not doing anything. What do? Well, you just need to keep turning in one of the directions, and eventually it'll start changing. And so if I go over the edge, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, somewhere in there, it's kind of lost over here. The dial doesn't do anything. What do? I just keep turning in one of the directions, and it eventually gets me back to this flexible program area. In my mind, it should only go to the limit, and then as soon as you click past 100 times, doesn't matter, you just click back once the other direction and it would fix it. It doesn't do it. I don't know why. I've tried to find out from Nikon technicians, and I haven't got a suitable answer, at least to my liking yet. But as long as you're aware of it, you know how it works, that's all that really matters. So that is the program mode. Next up, let's go to the shutter priority mode. As you can guess here, the shutter is the priority option here, and you can change the shutter speeds manually, and the camera is going to adjust apertures to fit your particular needs. ISO is once again completely independent. You set that on its own. So if you know you want a really fast shutter speed because you have a subject that's moving really quickly and you want a nice fast shutter speed to stop it, you set 1/1000th of a second or something in that range to stop the motion. If you want a long shutter speed, well, you can set a very long shutter speed, like 1 full second, and that'll slow motion down and give you a blurred streak of the river in that particular case. Now, the shutter priority mode, it sounds appealing to a lot of people, but I don't like this particular mode very much myself. And let me show you why. If you see any blinking, that means there is a problem. All right, so let's put our camera in the shutter priority mode, get her all fired up here. And immediately you can see we have a problem on the camera. The f4 is blinking, and that's because for some reason the camera has 1/8,000th of a second selected. And if you notice on the right-hand side of the screen, it says that we are underexposed. That indicator over there means that we are way overexposed. So we're going to change our main command dial, and we're going to lower our shutter speed until we get a proper exposure. And here we are at 200 f4. That sounds vaguely familiar from what we talked about before. And we're getting a proper exposure in there. Now we can adjust this around a little bit if we want. And you can see that as I change my shutter speed, you can see that the 50th of a second has kind of a gray box around it. That means we have manual control over it. Just like the ISO, we have manual control over that right now. F8 doesn't have a box. That means it's being controlled by the camera. If I wanted a longer shutter speed, let's say 2 seconds, which is going to be 2 with the little hash marks beside it, F22 is blinking, which means it's not the proper exposure. I'm not allowed to do a 2-second exposure. It's going to be overexposed. And I need to come back to where that F22 is not blinking. Because if it's blinking, it means the lens is not suitable for doing that. And so if I come back here to look like 1/8 of a second, it'll work there. And so as long as nothing is blinking, shutter priority works out fine. Now, if we did want to choose a faster shutter speed, say 1,000th of a second, the f4 is blinking, I have a couple of options. Number one is I can lower my shutter speed till it stops blinking. And there we are at 200th of a second. Or from 1,000th of a second, I could raise my ISO up a bunch and it stops blinking there. And the third option is I could replace this lens with probably a more expensive lens that allows in more light. And that would possibly solve the problem as well. And so there's a variety of solutions for solving any of those problems. But the problem with shutter priority is that there are lots of shutter speeds, there's not as many apertures, and you get caught in situations very easily where you don't have the right aperture on your lens to make that picture happen. So shutter priority is fine, but you do need to be careful about how you're using it. All right, next up is aperture priority. This one's a little bit more fail-safe here. So obviously you're going to be changing apertures, and then the camera will be controlling the shutter speeds here. If you know you want lots of depth of field, you can set a very small aperture like f22 to give you great depth of field from the foreground to the background. Or you can choose very shallow depth of field. Depending on what lenses you have available to you, you can get some very shallow depth of field, especially when you're focusing close up like this. And so in this case, you're going to be changing the aperture, and it's possible that there may be something blinking where the camera doesn't have the right shutter speed, but it's far less likely. Let's go ahead and move our camera into the aperture priority mode. And in this case, we're going to be using the front dial, which is the sub command dial, for changing our apertures on the camera. So we can change our apertures to any of the selected options. F22 in this case gives us 1/8 of a second. That looks like a good exposure. We can open it up to the maximum on this particular lens, which is f4, and we get to 2/50th of a second, and we don't get any blinking. If it was extremely bright or extremely dark, we might get into a situation where the shutter speed would be blinking, but it's just far less likely because there is a much more limited range of apertures and there is a much wider range of shutter speeds. And so you don't get caught in that same situation that you get caught with shutter priority in as easily. On to my favorite, which is manual exposure. And obviously here you're going to be able to set your shutter speeds and your apertures completely independently wherever you want. Now, the reason I like working in manual, I know it takes a little bit more time to get things set up, and it's only a little bit, but once you start shooting in a situation, you get consistent results. As long as the lights aren't changing, you're going to be getting the same exposure with all the things that you're shooting. And I really like having consistent exposures. That way I don't have to fuss around in post-production, lightening and darkening images, because there's different types of things going on in the image. I also like it when you're in tricky lighting scenarios where there's some unusual areas of light or darkness that might throw off the standard light meter in the camera. This allows you to take a couple of test shots, make sure that you're getting it right, And then everything from there on out is consistent lighting, even in tricky lighting scenarios. Now, when you're using manual, you're going to be using the exposure indicator to help you understand if your picture is overexposed or underexposed. And this varies in its positioning in the frame depending on whether you're looking in the viewfinder or monitor. But the main one you'll be looking at, hopefully, is in the viewfinder. That's where you get the best view of your subject. So this indicator is broken up into full stops as well as third stops. So you can see if you're just a little bit over, or a full stop, which is double the amount of light or half the amount of light. So you can see very clearly where you are. If you end up all the way to one edge, you'll get an arrow which lets you know that you are not even close. You are way far off the mark and you have a lot of adjustment to get it back to an even exposure. Let's take a quick look in here and practice with our manual exposure. Let's go ahead and flip the camera over into the manual mode with the mode dial on the top of the camera. We can see on the back of the camera right now that first off, things look dark in the screen, and the indicator over on the right-hand side is adjusted more towards the minus side, which means we're too dark by, it looks like, 2 stops of light. And so I can adjust my shutter speed, my aperture, or my ISO. And I'm going to adjust my shutter speed, which is right here, and I'm going to just go down to a little bit lower shutter speed. And looking at that indicator over on the right-hand side, this is the technically correct exposure, and that would be where I would want to shoot my photo. Now, maybe I don't like this combination of shutter speed and apertures. Maybe I would prefer to have an aperture of f8. So I'll set it down at f8. I'm now 2 stops darker than I should be, and I will once again adjust my shutter speeds back to an even exposure, and that is also a proper exposure. It's just with a different combination of shutter speeds and apertures. Now I can go in and adjust the ISO and any different combination in it. And when you get in there, you end up doing a lot of horse trade. Need a faster shutter speed, different aperture to adjust for that. Or I'll need a different ISO and I'm going to play with the aperture in order to get that. And that's part of the fun and the exposure of photography. Now, when it comes to the shutter speeds that are available on this camera, there's some interesting things to talk about. So let's talk about the shutter speeds. So the standard range on this camera is 1/8,000th of a second all the way down to 30 seconds. You'll notice that the fractions don't actually show as a fraction. They just give you a plain old number. Those are actually fractions. The full seconds have the little quotation marks beside it, so that you can see that there's hash marks. Then you know it's in full seconds. Now, this isn't all of them. It clutters up my screen, so I don't always list them, but there are third stops. And each click of the dial will give you 1/3 of a stop. And a full stop is double the light or half the light, which is a pretty noticeable amount. If you want just a little bit more light or a little bit less, you'd go 1 click, which is 1/3, or maybe 2/3. Next up, if you go past 30 seconds, you get to bulb and time. These are both different ways of doing very long exposures. There's 2 different methods for 2 different types of systems. Bulb is where you press down on the shutter release and the shutter stays open as long as your finger is on the bulb. This might work out very well for doing fireworks photography where you don't know how long you want to leave the shutter open. You just want to leave it open till the next burst of fireworks. And when that burst of fireworks happens and it's done, then you can take your finger off the shutter release and that ends the exposure. So it's any amount of time that you want, and you can decide whenever you want it to end. Now the time one is kind of similar. You press down on the shutter release to start it, but if you don't want to leave your finger on the shutter release for a really long period of time, let's say for 2 minutes, well, you can just let the camera do its exposure for 2 minutes and then come back in at the end of 2 minutes and finish the exposure by pressing the shutter release again. And so there are 2 different ways of doing essentially the same thing, a long exposure. Now, they're not as necessary on this camera as they are in some other cameras because Nikon has a great feature that I really like. It's called extended shutter speeds. It takes the shutter speeds from 30th of a second and it extends them out to 900 seconds. And so for those of you who like to do nighttime or astrophotography, there's a lot of preset times in here, so you don't need to use the bulb and time option in there. Now, these extended shutter speeds, they're nice, but there is something kind of funky that you should know about them. Normal shutter speeds work in third stop increments. And just to be very clear, 15 seconds is not 15 seconds. 15 seconds is 16 seconds because 8 seconds is 8 seconds. And if you want to double that, that more accurately is 16. And 30 is actually 32. But kind of setting that weird thing aside, just remember that. When you go into the extended shutter speeds, they're not third stops like the regular shutter speeds on the camera. You'll notice there's a little different increment in here. When you go from 30 seconds to 60 seconds, that's a full stop. That's one stop of light. And then when you go the next click, that's a half stop in light. And then the remainder of the extended shutter speeds are half stops. And so if you're quickly dialing back and forth from 15 seconds to 2 minutes, in some cases, a click is a third stop. In some cases, it's one stop. And in other cases, it's a half stop. So really look at the numbers as you're changing them to make sure that you are getting the correct increments that you want. Because sometimes you're trying to lighten things up or darken things up, and you usually kind of just go off a feel on the camera. And here you really have to look at the numbers to make sure that you know what number you are correctly at. But any of these long shutter speeds, whether it's bulb time or the extended shutter speeds, are great for doing nighttime photography. It's a great genre within the world of photography. So that is the manual mode. Next up is the U1, U2, and U3 mode. This is for user favorite settings. This is where you get to set the camera up the way you want it to work, some sort of predefined style of shooting that you normally like to do, and you just want to be able to quickly go to it and not have to make a dozen changes. And so it's kind of your favorite recipe for a certain style of photography. And the idea here is you set the camera up the way you want it to work, and then you program it in under Save User Setting. And then when you go to that dial setting, everything's set up the way you want. So let's go ahead and set this camera up the way that we want it to. So I'm going to set the camera up, and I'm going to decide to do mine in kind of general travel photography mode. And in that case, I like to use aperture priority. Now, as far as the aperture setting goes, I'm going to change it to 5.6. And for ISO, I'm going to set it down at ISO 200. Why? Just because I want it to be something that we can remember. So we're at ISO 200, f5.6, and then the camera figures out the shutter speed. Now I'm just going to jump in and change a couple of other things real quickly. I'm going to move my motor drive to the low setting, and I'm going to, let's see, I'm going to change my focus, and I know we haven't officially talked about this. I'm going to change it to a continuous, and I'm going to have it do a wide, large area. I'm just trying to do some specific things here. All right, so I got my camera set up. There are other things you could do. You could go into the menu and make all sorts of different changes here, but we're going to call it good for right now, just for time reasons. We are going to go into the wrench, and we're going to go to Save User Settings. Right here, we're going to go to the right, and we're going to save this to U1. I'm going to go to the right here, and I'm going to save these settings in there. Okay, so that is saved in there. Now I'm going to take my camera back to its kind of normal position, and I'm going to call this manual. I'm going to change my focus mode just to a medium basic point here, go back to single. I'm going to go back to my single frame here, and I'm going to adjust my shutter speed so that it looks normal here. And this is just my standard shooting mode for right now. And I decide, I want to go into my U1 mode. I turn the dial to U1, and you can see automatically up in the upper left, it says U1A, which means the camera is in aperture priority. If we look at our motor drive, it's in the low speed motor drive that we set. We set ISO 200, we set f5.6, that's all set up for us. If we look at our focusing system, we have it in the AFC with the large area, and that is exactly the way we set it up for U1. We can then switch it back into our normal operation. Now, you can do this with U1, U2, U3. And so you really need to think about how you use the camera and what sort of settings you would adjust. And so if you're new to photography, you're not going to have the information to set this up. But if you've been doing photography and you regularly shoot maybe your kid's sports team or theater work, and you know that there's certain settings on the camera that you always use when you do that weekly shooting event that you do, you can have everything kind of set up exactly the way you want it, and that way you don't forget something, and it's just easy and quick to go into that mode. And so if you use those modes, if you use certain types of menu recipes for different types of shooting, this is a great option to shoot with because it makes it fail safe. You know you got all the basic settings in there, and it makes it very quick and easy. And so how you get that set up, well, that's something you want to take a little bit of time and think about and go through all the different settings that you might set and get them set in there properly, and then go save them to U1, 2, or 3. So that is our mode dial. And just kind of final tip here, just because there's a whole bunch of options on here doesn't mean that you need to use all of these options all of the time. Most photographers like myself choose 1, 2, or 3 options that they use on a regular basis. They go back to those all the time. And there's a few on there that some people never ever use. And they're just options depending on how you want to use the camera. So pick the ones you like to work with and work with them. And that is your mode dial. So that's obviously very important as your kind of primary adjustment. But as we saw, in a lot of cases, you need to be setting the ISO independently and separately of what you're doing with the mode dial. Now, the ISO is controlling the sensitivity of the sensor, and it is a very effective way of making a brighter image or a darker image. But mainly its main purpose in my mind is to allow you to get to the shutter speeds and apertures that are most important to you. Now, you can press down on the ISO button and turn the main command dial. This is one of those safety protocol buttons where you have to be pressing down on the button for it to work. Now, the other option is that you can just dive into the photo shooting menu, and there's going to be an ISO sensitivity settings option in there where you can go change the actual sensitivity. So there's 2 different ways of doing this. Now, the native or base ISO on this camera is 100. So if you said, I want the best image quality possible, that's going to be 100. And so that's going to be the place that I recommend setting the camera most of the time, unless there's a reason to change it. Now, the lower setting at ISO 50 is very good when it comes to noise levels, but it's not as good when it comes to dynamic range or the range of light that it can capture. Most typically, you're going to lose a little bit on the high end, and so you're going to clip a little bit of the highlights, potentially if you have a very contrasty scene. I would use ISO 50 if I was trying to get a very slow shutter speed with a waterfall, and it wasn't too bright, there wasn't too many specular highlights in there. That might be a good reason for that. Most of the time, though, I'd be at ISO 100. As you need faster shutter speeds or more depth of field, usually it's the shutter speeds. As you need faster shutter speeds, you're going to start bumping your ISO up. With the full frame sensor on this particular camera, it's shooting very clean information, 100, 200, 400, 800, very, very good. But you always want to have the lowest ISO that you can, as long as you can get your other settings where you want them to. I think this camera actually looks pretty clean all the way up through ISO 6400. As you get higher and higher, you're going to notice more and more grain in there. It's not grain from film, but that's kind of what it looks like. There's more texture to it. It loses some of the detail and sharpness and smoothness to it. But if you need the higher ISOs, you use them, and you're generally using them to achieve a shutter speed that's either fast enough to stop an action that you are photographing, or maybe your hand holding of the camera. And so keep a low as ISO as possible. Now, one of the areas with Nikons that constantly aggravates me a little bit, and I don't know if I'm accidentally doing this or the camera's automatically turning it on somehow, is the camera goes into auto ISO. And this is where the camera will automatically adjust the ISO according to the needs of the shutter speed and aperture and giving you a correct exposure. This is a very simple automatic way of working with the camera. You can manually set up shutter speeds and apertures and have the camera automatically adjust the ISO. Photographers like myself that like to shoot manual and have more control will typically want to control this themselves. Let me show you a little bit more about this auto feature and turning it on and off. So right now, you press the ISO button and you turn the back dial for adjusting the ISO. And you can clearly see how it brightens and darkens up the scene and allows you to go and adjust shutter speeds and apertures to other settings. If you press the button and it's not quite as easy, I use my middle finger and I turn the front dial on the camera. that turns the camera on and off. It's essentially a toggle switch between automatic and manual ISO. And so now with the camera in auto ISO, let me actually change the shutter speed real fast. And you'll notice that as I change to faster shutter speeds, it starts bumping up the ISO. If I was to change the aperture, it might change the ISO upwards or downwards. And so some cases I want auto ISO, but many times I do not. And you simply press down on the button and you turn the front dial and it goes back to a pre-select setting for ISO. And then I can go in and I can adjust the settings as need be if I'm in a manual exposure. And so auto ISO is very simply done with the front dial. Standard ISO settings are done with the back dial. But anytime the auto ISO is on, it's not going to matter whether you're turning that back dial. So play around with that button and those dials to make sure that you're comfortable and you know how it works on your camera. Another button we have on the top of the camera is the exposure compensation button. And this is a good button for making your picture a little lighter or a little darker when the camera has some sort of automated control over what's going on. So you'd press down on this button and you can turn the back dial, which is a little bit easier, or you could press the front dial as well, and that will adjust. So either dial will do the same thing. Now the idea here is if you want a picture that is a little darker or you want it a little lighter, you can adjust anywhere from -5 stops all the way up to +5 stops. Now you will see information about this exposure change in the viewfinder or on the monitor on the back of the camera with the different systems that they have in there for showing you whether you're overexposed or underexposed. It might show you a graphic meter. It might give you a numeric meter in that particular case. Normally, with a normal exposure, you would leave it at 0. Now, be mindful that this is only going to have an effect on final images when you are in a semi-automatic mode, which means aperture priority, shutter priority, and program. And Nikon is kind of unique in that you can use exposure compensation when you're in the manual mode. It just doesn't change your exposure. It changes your exposure indicator and kind of gives you a way of fooling yourself. It's kind of like setting your clock 5 minutes ahead of time because you're always running 5 minutes late. Let me show you a little bit more about the exposure compensation button. Now, normally I would use this button in, say, aperture priority. So I can select a particular aperture, let's say f8. The camera has chosen 1/8 of a second as a proper exposure. And if I like that, I can go ahead and take a picture. Now, looking at this professionally speaking, we have a white cabinet. And this white cabinet is it should be a little bit lighter in the photo, but I think it's a little dark here. And I want to brighten this picture up a little bit. So I'm going to press down on the plus/minus, and I'm going to give this a +2/3 of a stop exposure. And I think that makes this look seen a little bit more realistic. And so I can now take my picture at 2/3 of a stop overexposed. If I wanted a picture darker, I would press down on the plus/minus, and maybe I want it really dark, and I'm going to go down to 2 stops exposure, and you can see it's there. Now, one of the things that's really important to remember is if I turn the camera off and I come back to it, it is still set in its minus exposure. And so you want to remember to set this back to 0 once you are done using this. Now this will work the same in the shutter priority mode, the program mode, but if you are in the manual mode, let me set up a proper exposure here first by adjusting my shutter speeds. You can see over on the right-hand side of the screen that I have an even exposure. I can go in here and say, you know what? Everything I shoot, I want to be 1 stop overexposed. You'll notice when I'm pressing down on the button, it shows 1 stop overexposed. And when I release, it says I am 1 stop underexposed. And so now as a photographer, I am looking at this going, oh, I need to brighten this image up by 1 stop. And I can adjust my shutter speeds. And there we are, we're shooting 1 stop overexposed. And that's because we have the exposure indicator set to 1 stop overexposure. And you can also see the little tiny plus/minus in the middle of the monitor on the back of the camera. That lets you know that it is set. And so this is fooling myself as a photographer thinking I have a normal exposure. And that's because I told you to give it a 1 stop overexposure. Normally, I would just adjust this to its one-stop overexposure. And so probably the most important takeaway from this whole conversation, reset it back to 0 unless you are specifically wanting to use this feature. So take the time right now, press that button, turn it back to 0. Only use it when you actually need to make your pictures a little lighter, a little bit darker, usually in Aperture, shutter priority, or the program. Now, if you don't like having to press the button to change the exposure, you can go into the custom settings menu under B3 Easy Exposure Compensation. And normally when you're in the program mode, you're only using one of those dials on the camera, whether it's the shutter speed, the aperture, or the flexible program that you're working with. The unused dial would become an easy way to change the exposure compensation without having to press the button down. So if you do this a lot, you don't want to press the button, well, there's a custom setting for you for doing that. This entire exposure system that we've been talking about so far in this class is based off of the light reading that the camera is getting with light coming through the sensor. Now, there is a metering pattern that is used, and that pattern has a big impact on your final exposure, and there are 4 different options. The standard option that is probably selected, the default option, is the matrix metering system. And what this does is it looks at the tone, the color, the composition, distance from the camera, so it's actually using focusing information. And this is generally good for a really wide variety of options. This is the best option with Nikon cameras for general light metering for most people most of the time. And very rarely will you ever need to change it out of this. Traditionally, cameras used a center-weighted system, and so they've included, for traditional reasons, the traditional center-weighted meter, which measures light in the middle of the frame and disregards areas off to the side. And so if you want to meter in that style and only pay attention of kind of big things in the middle, then you have center-weighted options. The spot metering can be very handy for people who are very particular and they want to read the light off of a small area, disregarding other light around there. And so the spot area is just looking at 1.5% of the frame, and so you can get very accurate reading over a small area. This can be done with a bird with a very light background. It can be done with skin tones on a portrait, for instance. It does require a little bit more skill. This is another one of those areas that you don't want to accidentally leave your camera set in a spot mode when you don't realize it. Reset it back to matrix because that's kind of the default option. There is also kind of an unusual one called highlight weighted area. And so it looks at the entire frame and it's really measuring for the brightest of the light. It doesn't mind some areas going very dark. And so this can help prevent overexposure in some unusually lit situations, perhaps a stage performance where a subject is in a spotlight, everything else is black around them. You don't actually want an average of the light and dark in that case. It's the subject in the light that's most important. And so that might be a good metering system for people with kind of unusual shooting situations that they're in. But for most people in most situations, you can leave it at matrix and it's going to be pretty safe pretty much all the time. A great way of determining if you have achieved the proper exposure is by looking at the histogram. This is a graph that shows you a display of the brightness that you have recorded. And as you understand more about histograms, whether things are underexposed or overexposed, they have very different shapes that are very easy to tell. And you can just simply hit the display button, and this cycles through some different display options. And one of the options is to show you the brightness histogram. Now, you can also see this when you play back an image. You can press the display button and you can see a histogram. And you need to press up and down on that multi-controller to get more or different information as it cycles through the different information in the playback. Now, if you are doing this right now on your camera, you might be screaming at me saying it's not working, and I understand it doesn't work. It's capable of working in this scenario, and for some unknown reason, which drives me nuts, especially when I do in-person classes and everyone's going, this doesn't work on my camera, it's because by default, Nikon has this turned off in the playback menu. And I want to show you right now how to turn it on. So let's go in and get this thing turned on the way it's supposed to be. All right, so we are going to go into the menu. We are going to go to the playback menu in blue, and we're going to come down to something called playback display options. What sort of things do we see when we play the image back? and we're going to see a whole bunch of unchecked boxes. All right, so what I want to do is I want to check the overview box, which is going to be down here. And how do I check it? I press the OK button. And then the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do a checkbox on the RGB histogram right up here. And I can either hit OK or I can go to the right. And you know what? I'm going to click off a whole bunch of this other information because you know what? When I shoot photos, I like to see lots of information. Let's make sure that we get all of these knocked off. And there is a whole bunch of them to be knocked off. More information, the better for me. This does not interfere with anything. I'm just playing back information and looking at things. Now, how do we get out of the menu system? Well, we press halfway down on the shutter release button and that kicks us back here. So if we go back and play back an image here, great. I can see the image very, very clearly, but now I'd like more information. Let's go up. Hey, there's one of my histograms along with my shutter speed, aperture, exposure information, all sorts of information. Hey, here's more information. I don't care about this information right now, but I might look at it later. And so this goes through all sorts of different data screens. And there's another histogram, this one in color, so that you can see if one channel is clipping. That can be handy in some scenarios. That's my favorite type of histogram. And so you can see more or less information by just going up and down on this, and you can leave it wherever you want. And the next time you play back an image, that's what's exactly going to come up, is that group of information. And so I think having all those checked off is a good place to start. If there's some of those certain things that you don't look at, you can uncheck them as you kind of narrow down what's most important to you. What you look at through the viewfinder and the monitor on this camera is showing you a display of what the final picture is going to look like. I think this is one of the big benefits of a mirrorless camera, is that as you are adjusting your shutter speed and your aperture, you can actually see whether the picture is getting lighter or darker. Yes, you also have information about the shutter speed changing in this case, or the exposure indicator over on the right-hand side changing. But just looking at that image is a great way of determining, is this picture too bright or too dark? Other times, this is not going to be so handy. If you're working with flash photography, if you're working in a studio, if you're working where there's lots of adjustments going on in the camera and you just want a clear view of what's going on, you don't care about it being brighter or darker. You can look at the exposure indicator over on the right-hand side of the screen to see if you're overexposed or underexposed. You can adjust the screens on this camera to show you the effects you're shooting or to give you an easy view through the viewfinder. And it depends on your priority within what type of shooting that you're doing. I think for most people, it's best to show the effects of shooting because then it makes it really obvious whether your picture is too bright or too dark. But if you're working with flash photography, or you just need a clear view and you don't want it to mimic the brightness of the final image, then you can set it to adjust for ease of viewing. And this is done in the custom menu under the view mode D10. And we're going to mention this again because this is really important. Important to know what you're looking at. All right, next up, auto exposure lock. The little joystick on the back of the camera, the sub selector, is also a button, and it is used for auto exposure lock and auto focus lock. What we're concerned about right now is auto exposure lock. And it's probably best to do a little demonstration to show you how this particular feature works. Now, this is going to work in the automated mode. So I'm going to put the camera in aperture priority. I'm going to open up to f4. I'm just going to adjust my shutter speed here back for our studio settings here where I like to have it. And let me just adjust so I can focus because I like to have things in focus. All right, so the camera is giving us a reading of f4 at 2/50th of a second. Let's just make this a little bit more complicated. I'm going to add in a little exposure compensation. I think this scene should be a little bit brighter by about 2/3 of a stop, okay? So now I'm at f4. The camera has chosen 160th of a second. All right, now if I kind of pan off to the side here, you'll notice the shutter speed's dropping because we're getting more dark areas. It's all the way down to a 60th of a second. And let's suppose I want that wacky composition for my own personal reasons, but I want that 200th of a second. What I would do is I would press in on this button, and you'll notice in the lower left, AEL blinks. It doesn't blink, it actually turns on. It locks the exposure at 200th of a second. So as I move off to the side here, I can take my wacky composition here and it has locked in that exposure. And so if I wanted to go over here and say have it darker at 80th of a second, I can press in, lock the exposure, and bring it back over here. And so this is a press in button, so you need to leave your finger pressing in on it. So currently in its normal state, it's doing locking exposure. There's another scenario where we'll be able to use this in focusing to lock the exposure, and you can have it do both at the same time. And so this is actually a fairly versatile button because you can go into the custom settings menu and you can completely reprogram this button. Because the aperture lock that I showed you is not something, say, I personally use, I could choose that to be some other function on the camera. And so if you don't find this particularly useful, not to worry, you can reprogram this button and do it later. All right, let's talk about exposure bracketing. So this is going to look a little similar to our exposure compensation, but if you use that feature and you say, you know, it'd be nice if the camera would adjust to shoot a whole bunch of different exposures all at like near to the same time so that I could walk away with a bunch of different exposure options that I can choose from later on. That's what exposure bracketing is all about. Now, the way that you activate this is in a feature called auto bracketing. And bracketing is just simply where you are shooting different photos and adjusting something in the photos. Exposure bracketing is one way of doing an auto bracketing series. And so first up, there's a feature that you can turn this feature on and off. Normally, you're going to leave it turned off. Once again, one of those things you don't want to accidentally leave turned on. So when you intend to use it, then you turn it on. Now you can do this adjustment with flash photography, white balance, active delighting feature we'll talk about in a moment. The most valuable one is the auto exposure option in there. And so that's the one we're talking about here. Now you can adjust and shoot different numbers of shots. How many pictures do you want to walk away with? And what is the increment of exposure difference from one shot to the next? You can have them pretty close together, or you can really spread them out if you want. This is really handy for people who are dealing with difficult exposure situations and they're not sure what the right exposure is, and they want to shoot a bunch in the field and they'll figure the correct one out later. It's also handy for people doing HDR photography, high dynamic range photography, where they use multiple photos and then they use a special program to compress all of those into a single photo, which picks out the best exposure parts of the different photos in there. And you can end up with some really good results. You can also end up with some wacky results. And so there's different reasons for shooting this. You can add exposure compensation on top of all of this to make everything all on the dark side or all on the light side or predominantly one or the other in there. And so this is something that we want to do a little demonstration on in here. Now I find this best to work with aperture priority because I like to have a consistent aperture from one picture to the next. Generally, this is going to be done with stationary subjects that aren't moving around, so shutter speed isn't all that important in here. And so what we need to do in here is I'm going to set my camera up ahead of time, and I'm just going to adjust my aperture to 5.6. Now I'm going to dive into the menu system. I'm going to go up to the photo shooting mode, and I'm going to work my way down to the bracketing options. Somewhere in here, auto bracketing, there we go. I'm going to go to the right and I'm going to turn this feature on. There's a little toggle switch for that. Auto exposure bracketing, this one does auto exposure and flash. I don't have a flash, so I'm just going to do auto exposure bracketing here. How many frames I'm going to do? Let's see. Let's do 7 frames. And all right, let's just do 1 1/3 stops between each image. And you can see a little graph down on the bottom as to where these images are going to be taken. We're going to press OK. All right, so we're going to be doing a bracketing series in here. And actually, I'm going to try to simplify things. I'm going to go back and I'm going to reset my exposure compensation to 0. You can see on the right-hand side of the screen that I can shift that whole series up and down, but I want to keep it at 0. So here is where we're going to go ahead and we're going to take 1, 2. I'm going to continue taking these, and you can actually see them over on the right-hand side of the frame. We have more to take, and I think we are done. there. Or actually, do we need to take our fifth one? Oh, I think I started a second series. This is why I don't like shooting them individually. I'm going to quickly shoot through. All right, so let's take a look at some information in here. I want to see more information. This is why we want to see all this information. All right, so this is a good one to see. So you can see here that I am at plus 2.7 over on the left-hand side on this exposure, plus 1.3, minus 1.3, minus 2.7, and our normal exposure. And so what it does is it shoots the normal exposure first, and then it goes way dark, and then a little dark, and then a little bright, and then way bright. And so it shoots through that particular series in that way. And there will be some further adjustments that we can adjust when we get into some more custom settings on the camera itself. Now, of course, most important thing, forgot, is that we got to turn this feature off because I don't want to have this feature turned on as we continue throughout the remainder of this class. So we go into auto bracketing and we come up here to the on switch and we toggle it off. And we can hit OK, or we can go to the left. We can hit the shutter release and back out of that. That feature is currently turned off. That will mess you up if you leave that turned on. So only use it when you actually need it in there. But it can be very handy in some, say, tricky landscape scenarios where you got some dark areas and bright sun in there. And always remember, turn that off. Glad I remembered. Next up, high dynamic range. Hey, we were just kind of talking about this high dynamic range. Well, this camera has high dynamic range built into the camera itself. It's honestly not as good as doing it yourself. If you know what you're doing and you shoot through 5, 7, 9 images and you go put them through a proper program, but it can do it here if you want to do it in camera. Not nearly as good, but it can do it. Now it is limited. It's only going to do a JPEG image in here, so you can't get raw images, whereas you could shoot individual raw images and go work with that in some post-production software. All right, so once again, we can turn this feature on and off. And we also have an on for a single photo, or we can do it on for a series. So maybe we're shooting a whole bunch of these things and we don't want to have to turn this feature back on all the time. Because on for single is where I normally do it. And when I shoot my photo, it turns this feature off. And so it's kind of nice that I don't have to go back, and that it's just a little bit easier and fail-safe that you don't accidentally leave this mode turned on. You can choose different strengths like low, normal, high, extra high, or you can let the camera automatically determine what it wants to do. And what the camera is going to do is it's going to shoot a number of different pictures and then combine them in the camera for one single photo in here. And so what it does is it's trying to lower the brightness of bright things, and it's trying to take things that are dark and make them brighter. If you look at the histogram, you can see how the shadow areas have been brought brighter, and areas on the far right of the histogram have been made a little bit darker. Now, if you do this too strong, the extra high setting, for instance, things can start looking a little bit funky in certain situations. And so this requires a little bit of personal experimentation to see what works right for the different types of subjects that you might shoot. One of the options in here is that if you are shooting in raw images, you can keep the original raw images, the overexposed image and the underexposed image, and you can work with those later, which is kind of nice. But what it does is it creates a final JPEG. Why would you use this? Well, if you want a fairly quick result out of the camera, not requiring additional software and computers, you had a situation, maybe you're photographing in a kitchen where you want to be able to see details in the kitchen, but also out the windows of the kitchen to see what's out on the deck or in the backyard or something like that. You want to see it all in one. You want to do it in camera. This would work out reasonably well in that particular scenario because it might be very bright outside and relatively dark inside, or vice versa. And that might be able to do it a little bit better than anything else for a single simple exposure. You're going to be able to do better if you do things manually and shoot individual bracketed images yourself, but this gets it done quickly in camera. Active delighting. This is kind of like the HDR shooting that we just talked about. The difference is that this does it in a single shot. And what the camera is doing is the camera is shooting a standard JPEG image, and then it goes into the controls that you might usually control later on, and it says boost the shadows and make sure the highlights don't get too bright. And it's just doing this from a raw image. And so this is basically saving you time from adjusting your images later on if you know you want a JPEG. Once again, this is going to require a little bit of individual experimentation to see how well this works. Where might this be most useful? I could see if I was shooting at an event, a party, a gathering of people, and I'm wanting to shoot people and I want to see their faces. And there's a lot of people who have shadows because of where the lighting is. And I want to be able to see the people's faces as clearly as possible. I could see leaving this on normal. I could play around with low, maybe high. Extra high is probably a bit much. Maybe normal or high. And it's going to just make being able to see those people in that contrasty lighting a little bit better if I'm working with JPEG images. Now, this only works with JPEG files. If you're working with RAW, it doesn't do anything to the RAW images. It only works with JPEG images. And so it's not a feature I think a lot of people use a lot of the time, but it can be handy in some situations where you want to boost those shadows and control the highlights a little bit. All right, that is the main things that you need to know about the exposure controls on this camera. There are some additional things that we'll touch on as we get into the photo shooting menu, and in the custom setting menu, you'll be able to customize some of these features a little bit more finely in there. And so look in those sections for additional information to further hone your setup on this particular camera. Although we've finished the section on exposure, there is a lot more that we could be talking about when you talk about the world of photographic exposure. And if you would like to know more about setting proper exposures, shutter speeds, apertures, ISOs, and a whole lot more, I do make an entire class that goes completely through photographic exposure. And so if you really want to hone that part of your photography, there is a class for you in that. And with that, we have finally reached the conclusion of this section. Now, the next 1 and 2 sections are also really important like this section. They're going to be fairly lengthy and in-depth sections. So this is probably a good time to catch a little break, play around with the exposure settings that we've talked about in here, and you'll be ready for the next section.